So I recently rented a car on Turo, and it was my first time and maybe the last time that I'll ever rent a car from Turo. So I recently had the opportunity to rent a car for the very first time on Turo. So I think Turo offers a unique opportunity to sample someone else's car that you might not otherwise have the opportunity to try. And so I thought I would give it a shot. And because my birthday was coming up, I decided to book something special. So I ended up finding a nicely optioned Porsche Cayman, which of course you can view the full review that I did on that car in my other video. Now, of course, the day didn't go exactly as planned, and I ran into some, shall we say, complications, which I will get into in a little bit. So on Friday morning, I picked up the car at this fellow's house. I do have to say the car looked a little bit dirty. Actually, it looked really dirty. The car was very dusty and covered with water spots. I stopped at a gas station and cleaned off the windshield just so that I could have a clearer view out the windshield. So as I'm just sort of exploring the car, I'm checking out the various features, and I decide, let me pop the trunk. Went to the back to try and open up the back, and it wouldn't open. I did get on the phone with the owner when he was free, and we kind of talked a little bit about the car, and I asked him, hey, by the way, is there something wrong with the rear trunk? And he was aware of it, but he hadn't let me know about that prior to picking up the car. But he did say, well, as a result of the automatic spoiler mechanism malfunctioning, the rear hatch will not open. Now, continuing on with the inspection of the car, I noticed that the front and rear tires were mismatched. If I recall right, the front tires were, I think, Kumho tires, and the rears were Michelin Pilot Sport 4s. In terms of front and rear tires, entirely different brands. Now, that isn't necessarily a red flag. Many sports car users end up doing something like that. Maybe your front tires and your rear tires wear out at different rates, and you have to replace one or the other, but not the entire set. And so, I don't fault him for that, but it was something that I sort of noted. I would think that the typical Porsche owner would probably want to run the same tires all around. And my guess is that if you had your car regularly serviced at a Porsche dealership, they would make sure that your tires were fitted to be identical all around. But, it wasn't a deal breaker. Everything seemed on the up and up for the most part. And I headed out to Patterson Pass. And driving out on Mines Road, I was starting to really get a feel for the car at that point and was really enjoying the drive. My hope and plan was to come out to the Junction, which is a small little restaurant and bar that's kind of midway along this road on the way to Mount Hamilton. But unfortunately, when I got there, they were not open for lunch. So I was a little disappointed by that, but I stopped and just took a few more photos and video clips, and then I continued on my way. Now, the backside of Mount Hamilton is actually one of my favorite drives of the Bay Area. That section of road is just wonderful with these sort of tight switchbacks and lots of sweepers and S-curves and just, the opportunity to really put a sports car through its paces. So whenever I have the opportunity to drive some kind of new sports car, that's going to be one of my go-to roads to try. So there is an observatory at the top of Mount Hamilton, Lick Observatory. Now, while I was up there, parked at the observatory, another sports car shows up, and it turns out to be a fellow BRZ owner. And so naturally, I walked over and said hi and said, hey, nice car. And me and this other driver ended up spending a little bit of time talking and checking out his car and just talking about sports cars in general. Made a new friend, and that was always a pleasure to meet another fellow driving and sports car enthusiast. And I decided to head back down the backside of Mount Hamilton back towards the junction. And that was, again, a wonderful drive. And so at this point, I was really in love with this car and having a good time. And to my pleasant surprise, the junction was actually open. So I decided to stop inside and see what was happening. There's an elderly lady behind the counter, and then there was a gentleman with a cowboy hat on, and he was sitting at the bar. And the lady, I believe her name is Marie, she told me, well, the only things available on the menu are the appetizers. I ended up ordering some onion rings and fries. And so that actually took quite a while. I struck up a nice conversation with both her and the gentleman, enjoying our time together while I waited for these fries and onion rings, which eventually came out and, in fact, were wonderful. Anyways, once I finished my fries and onion rings, I decided that I had better get going. It was almost sunset at that point. The gentleman wearing the cowboy hat, he had been essentially drinking wine out of a coffee mug. He apparently was so much of a regular that he had purchased a bottle of wine that the lady kept on his behalf at the bar. And whenever he came through, she would pour a little bit of it into this coffee mug for him. And so he had been drinking a little bit. And while I'm not questioning his judgment, I did decide that when the time came, it was probably best if I got out there on the road before he did. And so when the time came to go and he said that he was going to leave as well, at that point it became a little bit of a Le Mans style foot race, if you will, to get out to my car and try and get the car started and out of the parking lot before this gentleman could get behind the wheel of his truck. Now, fortunately, he was a bit more of an elderly gentleman, so he wasn't moving very fast, and so it wasn't a big deal to be able to get out to my car and get it started and out. And so I set off out on Mines Road back towards Livermore. I was taking it fairly easy. I'd already had a fairly good day of driving and was just trying to, make good time, but not push too hard, especially as it was starting to get dark. Now, this was when things started to go wrong. As I was driving along, I started noticing a vibration coming from the back of the car. So I slowed down and even pulled over to try and see if I could figure out what was causing the noise. My first thought was, oh, is there something wrong with the motor? But once I had stopped the car and pulled over but left the motor running, it sounded normal. Everything seemed fine. So it wasn't the motor. And I just looked around the back of the car, couldn't see anything wrong with the car, and so sort of continued on cautiously. But unfortunately, as I continued along on the road, the sound just started getting worse and worse. And I was starting to look for another spot to pull over so that I could try and investigate further when I heard a loud crash and bang coming from the rear of the car. And to my absolute dismay and shock, the rear wheel of the car came off the vehicle and flew off into the side of the road. And I could see it go flying off to the left as I ground to a complete halt right there in the middle of the road. And I was completely stunned. As you might imagine, having a wheel come off, the whole back end of the car basically dropped down on one corner and was just scraping along the ground. And like I said, I wasn't going very fast at that point. So I I had came to a stop very quickly, got out of the car, and just kind of stood there for a moment, not fully comprehending what had just happened. But when I came to my senses, I turned on the hazard lights on the car, and I kind of took stock of the situation and realized that, oh man, this car is completely stopped in the middle of this road, and I had just passed around a blind curve in the road. And so it felt incredibly sketchy. At any moment, potentially, a car could come around the corner and not see the car until the last possible minute because of the blind curve. And so I was afraid that somebody would come along, potentially at high speed, and not be able to stop in time and potentially hit the car. And like I said, because it was starting to get dark, visibility was not very good, and I had the hazard lights on, but I decided that the best thing to do was to step away from the car and stand on the side of the road, because I didn't think it was safe to stay near the car or sit in the car while I waited for help to arrive. So I felt like it was a very dangerous situation. To make things worse, I went to check my cell phone, obviously, to see if I could call for help, and sort of the double whammy. I was low on battery, and there was no cell phone signal where I was out there in the hills. So I'm standing out there, it's starting to get dark, and my only option at that point, I think, is to just wait and hope that somebody comes along before too long that I can flag down and ask for help. About 10 or 20 minutes later, a truck comes along. So he pulls up and kind of looks at me and says, "What happened?" And I basically responded, "The damn wheel came off." And he looks at me and he looks at the car and he goes, "Yeah, I can see that." And so, I explained to him what had happened, that the wheel had spontaneously come flying off the car and that I was stuck. And me, being completely stranded out here, sort of begged him for help and asked him if he might, be willing to drive back in that direction towards town and call for help. And so he turned around in his truck and drove back towards civilization. So I stood out there for a little while longer. He eventually comes back and says, "Yep, I called the CHP and they're calling a tow truck. And so they are on the way." He stuck around for a little bit, but ultimately, I guess he had somewhere he needed to be. So he left before the tow truck had arrived. And so once again, I was standing out there in the middle of nowhere. And at this point, it was getting very pitch dark. I was waiting out there for a little while longer. But eventually, another car came along. So this couple was super nice to stay with me and wait until the tow truck arrived. And so at this point, I'd say probably about 45 minutes had passed. So the tow truck finally arrives, and the driver gets out and he looks at the car and he's like, "So here's the deal. I charge $275 an hour. And the clock started when I got the call from the CHP. So what do you want to do? My time is being billed by the hour. What I can do is try and put this car up onto the flatbed and tow it into town. Now, I do have AAA membership, and in hindsight, maybe the right move should have been to somehow get out to civilization myself and make that call to AAA to try and get a tow truck sent out by AAA. But at the time, I didn't really have that option. I was kind of at the mercy of the CHP, whoever they called to come out. I asked the guy, "Well, are you affiliated with or do you accept AAA?" And he was like, "Nope, I do not." And so I was really kind of stuck there at that point. The car, like I said, was sitting out here in the middle of nowhere. just presenting a very sketchy road hazard, I think. And I would have been very reluctant to leave the car there, and somehow find a way to call AAA and sort of reset the clock in terms of calling another tow truck that wouldn't perhaps charge as much, or at least would be covered under the AAA membership that I had. So I kind of made the call to go with the tow truck driver that had come, and said, okay, that's fine. Let's have you go ahead and load this car up on the flatbed and let's tow it into town. And so, he took maybe another 20 or 30 minutes to carefully get the car pulled up by the winch onto the flatbed. And so I gave my thanks, huge thank you to that couple that, I didn't even catch their names, but they were super nice and kind to stay with me during this ordeal. So I climb into the tow truck with the tow truck driver, and we head back into town. And at that point along the way, we actually run into the CHP. He basically rolled down his window and said, "Oh, you've already got everything taken care of? Okay, I guess we're done here. Nothing for me to do." And so he just kind of turned around and left. So yeah, thanks CHP for the assistance. So as we head into town, I was going to try and get a hold of the actual owner of the Porsche. I wasn't really sure what to do with the car at that point. My initial plan or thought was that I would have the tow truck bring the car to the local Porsche dealership. But I figured if I could get a hold of the owner, perhaps he has a different shop or place in mind. And so I figured, why not ask him if I can get a hold of him if there's somewhere else that he would rather have me bring the car. And so I talked to him and say, hey, I got bad news. Then I kind of explained to him what had happened. To his credit, he, took it all in stride and didn't sound too panicked. And in fact, he sounded very apologetic. His initial concern was, am I okay? Am I safe? And so I said, yes, of course, everything's fine. I'm actually in the tow truck, and we are on our way with the car heading back into town. My initial plan of action was to take it to the Porsche dealership, but I wanted to give you that option. What do you want to do with the car? Is there another shop that you would rather have it brought to? And he says, okay, well, bring it back to my house. I'll put the wheel back on and I'll send you on your way. And I was kind of taken aback by that. So I said, I don't think you understand the situation here. The wheel came off of the car, and I'm not entirely sure that it's safe to just reattach the wheel to the car and drive away. We talked about it a little bit more, and he said, okay, well, let's see what we can do. Go ahead and have him bring the car back to my house, and we'll take a look. And so I told the tow truck driver, change of plan. We're not going to the Porsche dealership. We're going to go back to this guy's house. Prior to this, I had been talking to the tow truck driver, just kind of discussing what had happened. And what he had said was, well, to me, it looks like somebody, a shop or whoever was working on the car, had over-torqued the lug bolts. And it's that sort of improper fastening of the wheel to the car that caused it to fail and to have that wheel come flying off. At this point, when I told the tow truck driver, hey, the owner thinks that he can put the wheel back on, he wants us to bring the car back to his house. The tow truck driver was kind of like, well, I guess we know who did the work on this car. We arrive at the fellow's house, the owner of the car, and he's got with him a floor jack. So he comes over and he looks at the car, and his first sort of assessment is, well, I think we can jack up the car while it's still on the flatbed, put the wheel back on. Um, he and the tow truck driver start kind of discussing this, and I'm kind of just standing there off to the side because I'm not, I'm probably the least mechanically inclined of the three of us. Eventually, they get the wheel actually bolted back onto the Porsche. And so at the end of the day, he was able to actually start up the car and drive the car back off of the flatbed truck. So, success. Now, unfortunately, the car did see some damage from the wheel coming off. It had hit some of the fender liner and rear bumper of the car, and so a part of the rear bumper had come undone. Some part of the wheel and fender liner had been damaged. So cosmetically, the car was in a bit worse shape than at the beginning of the day. At that time, I wasn't really sure how that plays out, who's responsible for the towing of the car when something happens like that with a Turo or car rental situation. If it were a situation where it was a friend that had lent me a car to drive, I was driving it along somewhere and something happened to the car, it would, I think, certainly be within reason to think that I would have to foot the cost of that towing bill if I had borrowed somebody's car and was driving it somewhere when something happened. But, in this instance, it really wasn't my fault that the wheel came off of the car. I guess that responsibility does actually lie with the owner of the car. And so, in that sense, I guess it was perhaps the right thing to do for him to foot the cost of that towing. But still, it was a relief on my part to see that he owned up to that and was willing to take care of everything. He did not hold me responsible for any of the damages to the car. He basically was actually very apologetic about the whole situation. We both decided that it was the best thing to do would be to terminate the rental early. I wouldn't feel safe driving the car for a second day, given the damage that had happened to it. And I'm sure his plan of action was to, get under the car and take a look at the damage. It sounded like he was doing a lot of the work on the car himself. And so it seemed like he was perfectly okay with the idea of repairing the car on his own, or as much of it on his own as he could. And so I washed my hands clean of the car at that point. He said that he was going to take care of it, get things fixed, and of course probably go right back to renting the car out on Turo in the future. I guess I would consider myself pretty lucky that it wasn't a more serious accident. Had I been on the freeway, driving much faster when the wheel came off, it would have been a much more serious or catastrophic incident. So I guess I can look on the bright side there and say it could have been much more serious. And like I said before, he was extremely apologetic about the whole situation and said, hey, just FYI, I also have a Tesla that I rent out on Turo. So, either I'll give you the opportunity to, rent the Tesla for a good price, or, when I get the car fixed again, you can rent the Porsche for a full weekend next time when it's ready. And, I'll make sure that you get a nice price break on that. I said, that's very kind of you. Let me think about it. And just left it at that because I'm just not 100% confident that I want to be driving any more cars that he has touched. So I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this whole scenario. Would you give this owner and his cars another chance? I try to look on the bright side and take away something positive from the events of that day. This particular adventure, if you will, was actually an opportunity for me to experience the human kindness of others that I hadn't seen in so long. You know, the chance encounter with the other BRZ owner, the time I spent at the junction interacting with George the cowboy gentleman and Marie, the lady behind the counter, just spending time talking with people. The couple that stopped to help me, the gentleman in the truck that went to call for help, the tow truck driver, and the owner of the Porsche Cayman. I'd say he showed a lot of graciousness and kindness in taking on fully the responsibility for everything that happened. I think that I really learned an important lesson on that day, that, you know, despite all of the terrible things that have been going on and all the things that you see in the news, people doing terrible things to one another, despite all of those things, you can still go out there and find that deep down, when it comes down to it, you know, when the shit hits the fan, people do pull together and help one another. And I was able to see some of the very best of humankind, as opposed to the worst that you see in the news and stories online, and, you know, the tales that you hear from others. It was a very memorable day to have the wheels literally fall off of a car on you while you're driving. That's a bucket list item that I can now say I have checked off. So that is the story of my first and potentially last rental from Turo. I'm not 100% sure whether I want to rent another car from Turo, but let me know in the comments below what you think. Should I give Turo a second chance? There's certainly a lot of very interesting cars available on Turo, and my friends have used Turo on many occasions before with no incidents. And I know Turo actually offers insurance. Should I have sprung for that additional insurance? Maybe I should have. I didn't think I would need it. But in light of what happened, maybe it's better to be safe than sorry. If you have any experience with this, if you're either in the car rental business or the Turo business, or if you've actually had this experience where you had a car unfortunately get damaged during a rental, let me know if your experience with the insurance process has taught you anything that would be useful to share with me and with other people who are curious about how this all works. So leave a comment below. I would appreciate seeing any stories or information that you might have. Well, that's my Turo rental nightmare story. I certainly hope that no one else has to go through the same kind of difficulties that I've encountered. But if you have a similar horror story or something even worse, let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear what you've gone through as well. Thanks, as always, for watching. I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. I'll see you next time.